Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. She had just finished her final flight, still in uniform, pulling her rolling bag toward the porch of her ground-floor condo. The engine of her Jeep was still warm, the dash cam was still running, and the bullet that took her life landed less than 5 feet from her front door. This wasn't a break-in. It wasn't random. No signs of robbery, no struggle, just one shot, one point of entry, and one body on the concrete walkway in a quiet Lake Worth, Florida neighborhood, just before midnight on July 14th, 2025. The scene was clean, too clean. Her keys were still gripped in her left hand. Her Spirit Airlines badge hung loosely from her collar. Her travel bag had fallen on its side, front zipper torn open slightly from the impact. Her cell phone, still inside the Jeep. And for some reason, she never made it to the door. At 7:06 a.m. the following morning, a neighbor contacted 911 after noticing Cynthia's Jeep still idling in the driveway. The headlights had dimmed out, but the interior dome light was faintly glowing. A body lay near the front stoop. No movement, no response. Palm Beach County Sheriff's deputies were on scene within minutes. They secured the perimeter and documented a single gunshot wound to the left temple. No signs of forced entry to the home, no signs of defensive wounds, and nothing was taken. Her purse sat untouched on the passenger seat of her SUV. It looked like an execution, but there was no reason for one. Not here. Cynthia Ciarona Saith was 54 years old, a newly certified flight attendant working overnight legs out of Fort Lauderdale. She had only recently moved into her own place after finalizing a high-asset divorce just 2 months earlier. By all accounts, she was doing well, professionally, socially, and emotionally. At least, that's what she let others believe. Investigators began treating the property as an active homicide scene by 8:30 a.m. A mobile forensics unit from the Palm Beach County Crime Scene Division arrived shortly after. Early documentation confirmed no shell casing was immediately visible on the walkway, suggesting the shooter may have used a suppressed semi-automatic weapon and likely retrieved the casing afterward. That alone told detectives this wasn't opportunistic. This was deliberate. And then they pulled the footage. Inside the victim's Jeep Wrangler was a dashcam system hardwired to the vehicle's battery, activated automatically upon ignition, and configured to record front and interior angles. Detectives removed the SD card and sent it for immediate processing. The footage was time-stamped, 11:46 p.m., July 14th. The Jeep pulled into the assigned spot. Cynthia appeared in frame, still in uniform, her hair slightly messy from the flight, shoulders slouched in exhaustion. And she exited the vehicle, retrieved her bag, and began walking toward the unit. Then, just before 11:47 p.m., the image on the forward-facing camera caught a slight flicker. A dark silhouette, standing partially behind a hedge near the front entryway. The quality was poor. Infrared was on, no visible facial features, no distinct clothing markings, but the outline was human. At 11:47:16 p.m., the audio spike was clear. A pop. Then silence. The interior camera captured nothing beyond a momentary reaction, a quick flick of light, followed by darkness. Cynthia never returned to frame. The shooter never approached the vehicle. Whoever it was had known exactly when to strike and where to stand to avoid being fully captured. By midday July 15th, homicide detectives had begun canvassing the complex. They knocked door to door, pulled surveillance from neighboring condos, and requested ALPR, automated license plate reader, data from the city traffic system near the residential zone. It was a methodical start, but something about the neatness of the scene felt off. Detectives noted the consistency, clean, controlled, emotionless. There was no overkill, no passion, just one shot, center mass to the brain. As one investigator reportedly stated, off record, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. When a crime scene is this sterile, it usually means one of two things. The killer knew exactly what they were doing, or the killer knew exactly who they were doing it to. There were no witnesses, no loud sounds, no cries for help. A few residents mentioned hearing a popping sound around midnight but assumed it was a tire backfiring on I-95. The forensic pathologist from the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's Office arrived that afternoon. Time of death, estimated between 11:45 p.m. and 11:50 p.m. Entry wound, left temporal region, consistent with a single close-range shot. No GSR, gunshot residue, found on the victim's hands, ruling out suicide. Toxicology was clean. No alcohol, no drugs, nothing suspicious in her bloodstream. A single bullet, no shell, no suspect, no apparent motive. But there were questions. Too many. Investigators began compiling background data on the victim. A recent divorcee, independent, no children, no major enemies, no recent altercations on record. Her job with Spirit Airlines involved mostly overnight flights, returning home late, alone, and exhausted. A pattern. And then came the timeline, a pattern of surveillance, GPS anomalies. Vehicles passing by her condo at odd hours. One particular Jeep Wrangler, orange, four-door 2019 model, had been seen near the condo on multiple nights since early June, matching the description of a vehicle previously linked to a domestic disturbance case from 2024, a case that went nowhere. Detectives noted it, flagged it, but made no assumptions yet. Florida law doesn't allow for speculation to drive an arrest. You need evidence, hard, prosecutable evidence, and it was starting to surface. The homicide report listed her time of death as somewhere between 11:45 and 11:50 p.m. What it didn't say, but what investigators quickly understood, was that Cynthia's murder wasn't opportunistic. It was timed, calculated, carried out by someone who knew her schedule better than she realized. Forensics could only go so far on the body, but the digital trail she left behind, her movements in the weeks prior, told investigators something they couldn't ignore. Cynthia was being watched. In the days after the shooting, Palm Beach County detectives obtained court orders for Cynthia's cell phone metadata and location pings. She didn't use many apps, no Instagram, no frequent Facebook check-ins. She texted rarely, but her device still tracked movements passively. GPS data showed a consistent pattern of departures and arrivals. She left her apartment at roughly 3:50 p.m. on the day of her death, parked at Fort Lauderdale International Airport just before 5:20 p.m. She clocked in with Spirit Airlines and worked an evening domestic route, returning around 10:45 p.m. She departed the airport at 11 o'clock p.m. The Jeep was back in Lake Worth by 11:45 p.m. The problem was, someone else knew that timeline too. That level of precision, knowing when she'd arrive, where she parked, which door she used, wasn't guesswork. And it wasn't public information. It was someone with historical access. Detectives reviewed Cynthia's employment and personal history. She had finalized her divorce in May 2025, just 2 months earlier. Filed through Palm Beach County Court, the records were sealed, but portions were accessible under investigative authority. The final decree listed a distribution of assets totaling over $500,000, including a mandatory $285,000 settlement to be paid to her by the former spouse within 90 days. She retained sole ownership of her vehicle and a modest 2-bedroom condo in Lake Worth. The name of the ex-spouse appeared repeatedly in official filings, but investigators didn't name him publicly. Not yet. No cause to, procedurally, but they started building the context. They reached out to Spirit Airlines for access to her crew assignments. All confirmed. She worked standard flight shifts, including overnights and turnarounds. On record, she never missed a scheduled leg. Reliable, on time, predictable, too predictable. From June 1st to July 14th, Cynthia's Jeep was recorded by residential security cameras at her condo 24 times, always arriving between 11:30 p.m. and 12:10 a.m. Consistency was good for employers, but it also made her predictable to anyone observing. One condo neighbor later shared with law enforcement that, on 3 separate occasions in June, a vehicle was seen parked across the complex around midnight. Same vehicle, same spot, headlights off, engine quiet. No one exited, just idled for 10-15 minutes, then gone. The resident didn't report it at the time. It wasn't loud, it wasn't threatening, just off. In hindsight, it felt rehearsed. Detectives mapped Cynthia's full digital footprint for the 14 days before the shooting. Nothing suggested conflict, no threats, no confrontations, no incoming calls from blocked or unknown numbers. But that didn't rule out passive surveillance. They requested her vehicle service history. On June 24th, she had brought her Jeep into a mechanic near Fort Lauderdale for an oil change. During the inspection, the technician noted an unusual foreign object mounted beneath the rear bumper frame, a GPS tracker. The device was removed and turned over to Cynthia. No police report was filed. She didn't follow up. This detail wasn't initially public, but it became central. Cynthia had been aware, at least once, that someone was tracking her movements, and she hadn't reported it. Not to police, not to neighbors, possibly to no one. That silence may have been the last decision she made on her own terms. One of the lead detectives in a later briefing reflected on that moment. When someone finds a tracker on their car, that's not a prank. That's not random. That's a message. And if she didn't take it further, either she didn't know who planted it or she already did. Investigators now had motive grounds for concern, not just because someone may have killed her, but because it looked like someone spent weeks preparing for it. They started mapping financial records. They started looking at the divorce. And they started connecting names that had been carefully left out of public view until that point. Cynthia's bank transactions revealed standard usage: groceries, utility bills, gas, occasional small restaurant charges. But on July 8th, 6 days before her death, there was a wire transfer into her personal account for $6,400. It was a partial payment from the divorce settlement, marked only as payment 1 of 5. The sender's name matched the subject of the sealed court filings. Investigators flagged it immediately. That wasn't just financial context. It was a potential emotional trigger, the beginning of a money trail. On July 10th, Cynthia visited a local Chase Bank branch to deposit a check. She spoke with a representative for nearly 40 minutes. No official record of the conversation exists, but security footage confirmed her presence. Investigators believe she was updating account protections. They confirmed she had opened a new account that day, one not linked to the joint assets from the divorce. She had started separating her finances quietly. That type of move, according to experts in intimate partner homicide cases, often represents an inflection point, the moment where a target goes from vulnerable to exposed. In homicide cases involving domestic connections, money is rarely a background issue. It's often the fulcrum, especially when one party is ordered by the court to give up a portion of wealth they once fully controlled. By mid-July 2025, Cynthia Ciarone-Seith had received only a partial transfer from a court-mandated divorce settlement. The amount, $6,400, was documented in her checking account on July 8th, a small fraction of the total $285,000 owed. The remaining balance had not been fulfilled. Investigators began building the financial context of the months leading up to Cynthia's death, identifying a clear pattern: delays in payment, increasing asset protection measures, and signs of financial strain from the party responsible for the payout. Court records confirm the divorce was finalized on May 27, 2025, after a 2-year dissolution process. The filings named Richard Seith, an ophthalmologist based in Martin County, as the respondent. Cynthia retained ownership of their Lake Worth condo, along with her vehicle and a financial settlement to be paid in structured disbursements over 90 days. While most divorce proceedings involve lengthy financial disclosures, this one stood out. The documentation included a prior mortgage refinance, cashed-out retirement holdings, and irregular payments from LLCs partially owned by Richard. These red flags didn't indicate fraud, but they did reflect strategic asset movement, something forensic accountants are trained to notice. Detectives coordinated with a civil litigation specialist to review Seith's financial disclosures and recent activity. Within 72 hours, they identified a liquid cash deficit in multiple accounts associated with him. Several recent transfers had been moved through shell corporations, obscuring liquidity. That mattered because it created motive tension. Financial pressure isn't direct evidence, but it often correlates with escalation. On June 12th, just 5 weeks before Cynthia's death, a court-ordered payment schedule had been sent to Seith's counsel. It outlined 5 equal transfers due on the 15th of each month, beginning in June. According to bank records, only the July payment was received, and late. Cynthia had kept the transaction details private. There was no police report about missed payments, no formal contempt filing, but in digital notes pulled from her cloud account, investigators found a draft email written but never sent. It read, "He's stalling again. If this drags out any longer, I'm going to file a motion. I'm not backing off this time." The timestamp was July 5th, 9 days before the shooting. Investigators also obtained search warrants for Seith's property and financial software. Among the files recovered from a home office desktop was a printout of the divorce decree, highlighted in 2 sections. The respondent shall pay the petitioner a total of $285,000 USD in 5 scheduled transfers. Any interference with the petitioner's employment or residency shall constitute a violation of this agreement. The second clause wasn't common. It had been specifically requested by Cynthia's legal team during final mediation. She had insisted on it. According to legal notes, the clause was added following an incident in 2024 where a neighbor reported a vehicle similar to Seith's circling the condo after midnight. No charges were filed, but the concern was logged. That same clause, now re-emerging in 2025, became a focal point for the detectives. It meant Cynthia had anticipated interference. She just hadn't expected it in the form of a homicide. On July 11th, 3 days before the murder, security footage showed a Jeep Wrangler parked 3 blocks away from Cynthia's residence at 11:38 p.m., lights off, plates partially obscured. The footage wasn't detailed enough to read the plate, but detectives were working on a timeline. It placed a matching vehicle in the area during the week. Cynthia had escalated plans to separate her finances and reinforce personal boundaries. She was, in essence, asserting independence, financially, legally, and geographically. In domestic abuse typologies, this phase is often where violence is most likely to spike. Notably, Cynthia had also applied for a protective address registration in late June, Florida's Address Confidentiality Program, meant to shield locations for survivors of domestic abuse. The application was incomplete. She never followed up. That partial action, too, fit a common pattern, a person moving forward but cautiously, aware they're being watched, unsure how far it might go. Investigators compiled all financial and legal evidence into a structured sequence. The motive was beginning to crystallize. A substantial financial settlement had been ordered. Only partial compliance had occurred. Additional steps were underway to enforce compliance. Surveillance of the victim had continued well after the divorce was finalized. And shortly before her death, the victim had begun shielding accounts and housing records. The progression wasn't circumstantial, it was linear. As one lead investigator noted privately, in cases like this, it's not about what's said, it's about who still has access. The homicide team wasn't ready to release a suspect name, not yet. The forensic report wasn't complete. The dashcam silhouette hadn't been identified. But internally, they had already shifted the investigation from general homicide to targeted domestic lethal violence. They began constructing the suspect timeline, not from the night of the crime, but from 6 weeks earlier, when the money was ordered and when Cynthia quietly began to prepare for resistance. And they knew something else. People who plan attacks of this nature don't just act, they stage. What they needed next wasn't motive, it was method. How the killer approached, how they left, what they knew about her routines, and where that knowledge came from. In the next phase of the investigation, digital forensics would take center stage. By the time forensics cleared the crime scene, the Jeep was already in evidence. The dashcam footage had given investigators a timestamp, a direction of movement, and one blurred silhouette. But that wasn't the only digital signal left behind. Cynthia's vehicle, a 2018 Jeep Wrangler, had recently been fitted with a new infotainment system, one that automatically synced location data via Bluetooth when connected to her phone. That meant every trip she made, every idle stop, every pause in motion, was logged with time-stamped GPS coordinates. The data wasn't designed for law enforcement, but now it was part of a murder investigation. Investigators subpoenaed the vehicle's onboard diagnostics and location history. What they found confirmed a theory already forming behind closed doors. Cynthia's movements had not only been predictable, they had been known. Digital forensic analysts pulled GPS logs going back 45 days. Patterns emerged almost immediately. Her commute to Fort Lauderdale, routine gas station visits, the exact minute she returned to Lake Worth. But alongside those logs were duplicate paths, movements recorded near her route, often trailing behind or appearing stationary near her location for extended periods. The first overlap appeared on June 19th. She left work at 11:08 p.m. 10 minutes later, another signal, pinged from a nearby device, appeared within 100 feet of her home address. No known contacts in her phone matched that signal. It didn't originate from her own devices. It wasn't the car's native system either. This secondary signal repeated on June 22nd, 25th, 28th, and again on July 3rd. Always within 5–10 minutes of Cynthia's arrival at home. Always unpaired, always gone before sunrise. The presence of a tracking device wasn't just speculation anymore. It was verified. It had been active for weeks. Remember the June 24th oil change? The technician's report included an entry that investigators hadn't focused on in earlier interviews. Client requested visual check for loose wiring under chassis. Found small magnetic housing attached to rear suspension, removed and placed in glove box. That housing was now in custody. Analysts disassembled the unit. It was a basic GPS tag, passive, battery-powered, with no audio or video function, the kind available for under $200 online. But it had one telling feature: a subscription ID burned into the firmware, identifying the service provider used to monitor the device in real time. That ID led detectives to a web-based tracking dashboard registered under a pseudonym. But the email address used to set up the account, though masked, had partial recovery options tied to a phone number previously linked to Richard Seath. That wasn't enough to file charges, but it was enough to warrant digital search orders. Cynthia's phone, also in evidence, revealed no direct threats. No hostile texts, no repeated blocked calls. But when forensic techs performed a system-level scan, they found Bluetooth handshakes from unknown devices, mostly harmless, except for one entry that stood out. On June 17th, her phone had paired, even briefly, with a device named Wrangler Cam. That name didn't correspond to any system in her Jeep or her home network. Investigators believe it may have been a dash cam or mobile hotspot used by a trailing vehicle, close enough for her phone to attempt a connection. Proximity like that, measured in feet, not blocks. Someone had followed her. Often, close enough to mirror movement. Close enough for hardware to register each other. Close enough to know when to strike. In a recorded debrief, one detective described the surveillance setup. It wasn't complex, it wasn't high-tech, it was just quiet, and that made it harder to notice but easier to execute. Detectives now had a clearer view of the timeline. GPS tracking initiated no later than mid-June. Confirmed device removals around June 24th. Continued proximity pings after tracker was removed. Bluetooth handshake within 5 feet of victim's phone. Final untraceable device signature. July 14th, 11:45 p.m. Each signal built a path, not just of where Cynthia had gone, but who had been behind her. Investigators expanded the signal radius analysis. They used cell tower triangulation to match known vehicles and devices within range of Cynthia's location during key dates. Most were dismissed: delivery drivers, other residents, rideshare traffic. But one device ID appeared 6 times, each within a 10-minute window of her routine returns home. The number had no active service. The IMEI traced back to a prepaid burner phone activated in Martin County in late May. Purchase record: paid in cash at a gas station 4.3 miles from Richard Seath's residence. Again, not conclusive, but stacking, all of it stacking. By July 20th, the team had created a forensic motion map, a visual overlay showing Cynthia's route home, overlaid with signal markers, ping times, and tracker data. The final night showed a dot sitting still near her building from 11:26 p.m. to 11:48 p.m. No camera ever saw the driver. No dash cam from another resident caught the license plate, but the timing was exact. It aligned with the moment she parked, the moment she stepped out, the moment the shot was fired. Someone had waited, calmly, silently, then disappeared. There was no randomness left in the narrative. The victim didn't stumble into danger. She was delivered to it by her own routine, her own familiarity, her own expectation that home meant safety. For all the warnings she may have felt, Cynthia hadn't reported a thing, but the tech did. The signals never lied. What happened next wouldn't be invisible. Investigators were about to take this digital evidence and link it to physical surveillance. Because tracking someone is one thing, placing yourself at the crime scene is another. The scene had been processed, the body removed, and digital forensics already revealed Cynthia's every step that night. But digital evidence doesn't act alone. In cases like this, the weight of physical trace can either break an alibi or quietly verify what digital signatures suggest. The area where Cynthia was gunned down, just outside the entrance to her ground floor condo, had been swabbed for biologicals and fibers within 8 hours of the shooting. The surface was concrete pavers, easy to clean, but still textured enough to trap particulates. The Florida summer had been dry that week, no rainfall, no cross-contamination from sprinklers or runoff. That mattered. CSU recovered 3 primary elements: 1 partial boot tread, a faint oil smear, and a fibrous residue less than 4 mm long caught in the seam between 2 pavers. Individually, none of these details pointed to a specific suspect. But together, they started to define movement, how the shooter approached, and possibly what they were wearing when they did. The tread mark, measured at 11.75 inches long and 4 inches wide, had a partial manufacturer imprint visible on enhanced imaging. The pattern matched common tactical-style work boots, specifically a model sold by 5.11 Tactical, frequently worn by law enforcement, contractors, and security personnel. That didn't narrow the field, but it excluded casual footwear. The oil smear told another story. Tests showed a residue consistent with synthetic gun lubricant, the kind used to maintain semi-automatic pistols with suppressor-ready threading. The smear wasn't from the vehicle. It wasn't motor oil. It had dripped straight to the ground near the area where Cynthia had fallen, just beyond the initial spatter zone. One of the CSU leads made a note in the field log. This came from the shooter, either from their weapon or their gloves. It's transfer, not ambient. Glove prints weren't visible. But latex gloves rarely leave prints, and those who plan targeted shootings often wear nitrile or latex to avoid trace DNA. The fibrous residue was sent to the Palm Beach County Forensic Lab for microspectrophotometry analysis. Result: synthetic nylon blend, black-dyed, abrasion damaged. Most consistent with the interior lining of tactical gloves or lightweight sleeves. Again, none of this proved identity, but it reinforced what digital forensics had shown. Someone had waited there, prepared, equipped, and protected. At the same time, detectives re-examined the Jeep Wrangler captured in the background of the July 11th surveillance footage. A vehicle parked 3 blocks away from Cynthia's home, just before midnight. ALPR data pulled from a municipal camera located at Lantana Road and Military Trail logged a Jeep of matching make and color turning northbound at 11:15 p.m. on July 14th, just 32 minutes before the fatal shot. By mapping that movement with cell tower logs and environmental readings, analysts identified a heat signature anomaly near the crime scene consistent with an idling vehicle between 11:25 p.m. and 11:48 p.m., the exact time Cynthia returned home. As part of the investigation, detectives obtained a search warrant for Richard Seith's residence in Jensen Beach. Execution of the warrant occurred on July 18th. In his garage, investigators located a pair of tactical work boots consistent with the size and sole pattern found at the scene. The boots were clean, but fluorescent testing revealed a faint petroleum trace in the treads. No DNA was present on the soles. In a hall closet, crime scene techs discovered a soft nylon glove, black inside out, with minor tearing along the inner seam. The glove was tested for trace evidence. Fibers collected matched the chemical signature of the residue found at the scene. That match didn't place Seith at the scene, not definitively, but it did something else. It made his known possessions consistent with items believed to have been used during the homicide. Detectives also tested the surface of Seith's workbench. Swabs came back positive for cleaning solvents used for firearms, particularly one designed to minimize powder trace and odor. No weapon was recovered during the search. But receipts pulled from his trash showed the purchase of a firearm cleaning kit and synthetic oil from a local sporting goods retailer on July 10th. The purchase wasn't illegal, but the date was critical. To close the forensic circle, investigators requested ballistics trajectory modeling based on wound location, shooter height estimate, and angle of entry. Result: the round was discharged from an elevated arm height, roughly 5'10", and at a downward angle of 12 degrees. The shooter had been standing at least 2 feet back from the body. No struggle. Cynthia never saw the shot coming. There were no fingerprints, no surveillance footage showing a face. But what emerged from this stage was an operational pattern. Approach from a concealed position. Stand behind the entryway hedge line. Wear protective footwear and gloves. Use a suppressed firearm with clean lubricant. Exit cleanly within 60 seconds. Leave no physical ID trace behind. It wasn't improvisational. It was methodical. One investigator summarized the stage this way. He didn't leave his name at the scene, but he left the work. I've sat through a dozen case files that began quietly, missing persons, domestic disturbances, mental health complaints. But this case, the Penelope Jackson investigation, broke protocol by sheer chaos. By chapter 6, we weren't in the dark anymore. We were in the thick of something that felt dangerously rehearsed, by someone who believed they could rewrite the truth. On the morning of March 2, 2021, the forensic team completed their second sweep of the Jackson residence in Barrow, Somerset. By now, blood spatter analysis had confirmed what the first pass only implied. The attack began in the kitchen and ended in the lounge. But here's what shifted the entire tone of the investigation: Penelope's phone. Digital forensics showed that Penelope had made not one but 3 calls to emergency services, none of them made in panic and none of them cut off. Each lasted over 7 minutes. The audio revealed chilling composure, calculated pauses, and a vocabulary that sounded less like distress and more like documentation. She referenced her husband David by full name. She stated the weapon. She volunteered the injuries. She corrected herself mid-sentence to clarify the sequence of stabs. No one asks for a clean narrative unless they know how messy things really are. From a strictly evidentiary standpoint, these calls became the centerpiece. Not because they showed a moment of horror, but because they lacked it. Investigators red flagged the intentional tone. This wasn't a woman snapping. This was a woman explaining. As detectives re-interviewed neighbors, it became clear this wasn't a household foreign to shouting. But what everyone found strange was how quiet things had been leading up to that night. No police calls in weeks. No slammed doors. Just a quiet lull, something one officer later called the calm before a strategic storm. Then came the bedroom drawer. Hidden beneath socks and old prescription bottles was a printed journal entry. Not handwritten, typed and printed. It detailed past abuse, manipulation, and control. But instead of dates and names, the page was written in second person, like a script being rehearsed. Forensic linguists reviewed it and raised a flag. This wasn't a reflection, it was a draft. You see, what throws most people off in a domestic homicide case isn't always the violence, it's the narrative architecture. And Penelope, whether through intention or desperation, had created one. As we reviewed hospital records, no recent injuries matched the entries in that document. David Jackson's work history, meanwhile, confirmed a decorated military career. Yes, strict, but respected. No formal complaints had ever been made against him. Not from Penelope, not from neighbors. Not from anyone in his orbit. Detective Inspector Bell, the case lead, put it plainly in a press-only review later that year. We weren't dealing with a pattern of violence escalating to murder. We were dealing with a murder looking to fit a pattern. What came next would make that claim harder to ignore. In a surprising move, Penelope waived her right to a solicitor during early questioning. She wanted to talk. She wanted it recorded. She began speaking before the tape started rolling. She asked if the forensic team had found the kitchen towel with the first blood wipe. She asked if they knew about the phone's voice memo. She described, unprompted, where the steak knife had fallen between strikes. This wasn't trauma. This was strategy. And still, every sentence she delivered was calculated to redirect. He was monstrous, she said. He gaslit me. He owned me. But when asked why she hadn't called police during any of those instances, her answers returned to vagueness. I didn't think anyone would believe me. It was always behind closed doors. He knew how to hide the bruises, yet there were no bruises. Not fresh ones, not old ones, nothing recent, nothing dated. The pathology report confirmed David Jackson had been stabbed multiple times. One strike pierced his chest fatally, while others showed hesitation marks, which is uncommon in defensive wounds. This, coupled with the lack of defensive injuries on Penelope, tilted the scale of interpretation further. We weren't seeing a woman who reacted in panic. We were seeing one who prepared. By the time Penelope Jackson appeared before the court at Bristol Crown in October 2021, the public narrative had already split into 2 factions: those who believed she was a battered woman pushed beyond her limits, and those who saw the evidence as deliberate, staged, and targeted. But inside the courtroom, only one version of events would survive scrutiny, and it wasn't going to be shaped by sympathy. It was going to be built on forensics, testimony, and legal precision. The prosecution, led by Christopher Quinlan KC, moved quickly to establish premeditation. They submitted the 999 call as central evidence, playing it in full before the jury. No edits, no dramatization. Just the flat, unshaken tone of a woman who claimed she had had enough, and that she thought she got him in the heart. Quinlan paused only briefly after the tape ended, before presenting the timeline reconstructed from Penelope's own statements and from the digital and physical evidence in the home. They backed it with cell tower data confirming the absence of any prior emergency reports or silent alarms from the address, contradicting her claim of prolonged abuse. The stab wounds, 3 in total, had been clean, frontal, and fatal. There was no sign of defensive wounds on David, no bruising on Penelope, no fresh medical history to support long-term physical harm. The prosecution's medical expert concluded David had likely been caught off guard and never fought back. Penelope's defense attorney, Claire Wade QC, centered her argument on psychological trauma. She argued that years of coercive control and emotional degradation had created a slow-building mental prison. Wade acknowledged the lack of police reports, but attributed it to shame and fear, common factors in domestic abuse cases. Her strategy wasn't to deny the act, but to reframe its motive, not premeditation, but culmination, a psychological explosion, not a planned execution. To support this, the defense introduced a psychiatric evaluation. The doctor testified Penelope displayed symptoms consistent with complex PTSD and, while competent to stand trial, had likely experienced distorted perceptions in the moment of the crime. However, the cross-examination from the prosecution undermined this claim. The psychiatric expert admitted under oath that Penelope's behavior post-homicide, calling 999, calmly informing dispatch, and voluntarily pointing out where the knife had been placed, did not align with typical psychotic dissociation or panic response. The trial never turned into a shouting match. It remained throughout clinical. Every assertion had to be anchored in evidence. The jury was shown crime scene photos, the kitchen, the lounge, the precise blood spatter that indicated movement. Audio from the neighbor's CCTV picked up no shouting or struggle before the fatal encounter. Penelope's voice on the emergency call remained steady, sometimes almost instructional. One piece of evidence stood out: a voice memo on Penelope's phone recorded a week before the killing, never sent, never referenced. In it, she rehearsed part of the 999 call. She practiced describing David's location and the knife. The prosecution didn't need to editorialize. They played the recording once and rested the argument. This was not a spontaneous act. The defense didn't contest the memo's existence. Instead, they claimed it showed Penelope had been contemplating escape, not murder, and that her mental state had deteriorated to the point of rehearsing scenarios. The jury would be left to decide whether that scenario was survival or strategy. Outside the courtroom, media coverage was split. Some headlines painted Penelope as a trapped woman finally snapping. Others focused on the cold precision and digital footprint that mirrored a pre-written playbook. But inside, the jury wasn't reading headlines. They were listening to facts. Every trial has a tipping point. In this case, it wasn't a confession or a surprise witness. It was the calm in Penelope's voice, the absence of panic, and the silence from her past. On November 10, 2021, Penelope Jackson was found guilty of murder by a unanimous jury. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with a minimum of 18 years. She showed no emotion, no remorse. The court rejected her claim of provocation. Evidence showed she stabbed her husband not in panic, but with clear intent. She called 999 herself, calmly admitted what she did, and made no effort to save him. The body cam footage sealed it. She was cold, calculated, and in control. Forensics confirmed 3 stab wounds, 1 to the heart, no defensive injuries on David Jackson. The killing was not spontaneous. It was methodical. Though some argued years of emotional abuse led her to snap, the court ruled that her actions were not those of a desperate woman, but of a deliberate killer. In the end, justice focused on facts, not feelings. And those facts, bloody, clear, undeniable, ended with Penelope behind bars, likely for life. In the end, stories like this one aren't just about crime. They're about control, silence, and the hidden wounds families carry behind closed doors. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: Suffering in silence doesn't save anyone. If something feels wrong, speak up. If someone needs help, don't look away. What would you have done in Penelope's place? Do you believe justice was truly served? If this story moved you, or even challenged your views, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from, or what this case made you reflect on. And if you didn't connect with the story, I'd still love to know why. If this video resonated with you, subscribe to the channel for more true stories that matter. Your voice keeps these conversations alive.